All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're
Ooh.
taking on a topic a lot of you have been asking about, witch hunts. We're going deep using excerpts from the Dutch Wikipedia article Hexenschat. It's been really fascinating to dig into, but yeah, a little unsettling too, because it's not just some history thing. Like modern day witch hunts are shockingly real.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? It's so important to understand. We talk about witch hunts, but we're not talking about like women on broomsticks.
Right.
The article defines it way broader as persecuting any group and usually based on like flimsy evidence, if any at all. And it gets to like how fear and power dynamics and needing someone to blame it creates this toxic environment, no matter if it's the 1600s or today.
Yeah, that really changes things. When we think about the classic European witch hunts, from the late 1400s to the 1700s, it's easy to get stuck on the numbers 40,000 to 100,000 people executed.
hmm
But reading the article, I realized this wasn't some weird little thing. It was like built into society.
Absolutely. Back then, the church had huge power, both religious and political. Plus, all the anxiety about disease, famine, all that stuff people couldn't explain. It was like the perfect setup for these accusations to take off.
Right.
And we have to remember, it wasn't just the church, though. Local authorities, political rivals, even just neighbors who hated each other, accusations were a way to get power or get back at someone.
And the article brings up this chilling handbook, the Malleus Maleficorum. It translates to Hammer of Witches, and it was a guide to hunting and prosecuting suspected witches right at the peak of the European witch hunts. And it wasn't some obscure book either. It was everywhere, went through tons of editions over the next couple centuries.
Yeah, the Malleys did a lot of damage for sure. It laid out ways to identify, interrogate, even torture suspected witches, and they used techniques that like made people confess to things they didn't do. They even said that just saying witches don't exist meant you were one.
Yep.
It's crazy how easily fear and prejudice can get turned into like rules and weapons.
Scary to think how one book could cause so much horror. And it wasn't just Europe either. Those fears came over to America with the colonists, right? The Salem witch trials in the late 1600s are a perfect example of how that anxiety took hold, even in the New World.
Salem is fascinating, but so tragic. It wasn't just religion either. It was about all this social tension boiling over in a community that was already divided, fighting over land, religion, all of it. And then these young girls start acting out, doing things we'd probably call unusual today, and the whispers about witchcraft became full-blown accusations.
Yeah, like you have all this tension already, and then these girls who are already kind of outsiders start acting strange, having fits, screaming uncontrollably, stuff like that. And back then, when everyone believed in the supernatural, it's not hard to see why people thought it was something demonic.
Exactly. And that's where the power stuff comes back in. The girls mostly accused people who were already vulnerable, poor folks, older people, anyone who was different or caused trouble. It got so bad that they even allowed spectral evidence in court that's like dreams and visions. Imagine being convicted because someone dreamed your spirit did something bad.
Really shows how a community can just fall apart when fear takes over, and how accusations can be used against people who are already struggling.
Yeah, but Salem is often seen as a turning point. The accusations were so crazy, and even important people got caught up in it, that people started to question the whole witchcraft thing in the West. It wasn't instant, but things were shifting.
But here's where things get really unsettling. The article says witch hunts aren't just in the past. They're still happening all over the world. And it points out it's not just about individual accusations. There are actual laws against witchcraft still in some countries, like Saudi Arabia and Cameroon.
Yeah, laws like that show how deeply rooted these beliefs are and the danger they pose to people. But the article focuses on the places where these beliefs are strongest, where they often lead to terrible violence. We're mainly talking sub-Saharan Africa, India, and Papua New Guinea.
And these modern witch hunts aren't just about old beliefs, right? They're tied to modern problems.
Yeah.
The article gives some chilling examples from Africa, where believing in witchcraft is common. You've got business rivals blaming each other, politicians saying they lost elections because of witchcraft. It's used as a weapon in all kinds of power struggles.
Right. You can't forget the context. A lot of these places are dealing with extreme poverty, lack of education, limited health care. When bad stuff happens, crops fail, people get sick, a child dies. They try to find reasons, try to make sense of it.
So it's not necessarily that people reject logical explanations entirely, but that witchcraft beliefs provide a way to understand misfortune and find solutions within their culture, right?
Exactly. It's about trying to gain control in situations where they feel powerless. Sadly, that often means blaming and accusing others.
And the article mentions some pretty disturbing beliefs about witchcraft in Africa. It's like some of the European stereotypes, which is flying, dancing naked in cemeteries, but with a unique African twist. They believe in witches eating corpses, stealing men's genitals, even shape-shifting into animals to cause harm.
Yeah, those beliefs come from deep anxieties about the unknown, about forces beyond our control. But it's crucial to remember these aren't just abstract beliefs, they have real consequences.
Mhm.
The article lists a whole bunch of countries where witchcraft accusations lead to violence: the DRC, Tanzania, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Cameroon, Kenya, Gambia, Zambia, South Africa.
That's a long list. It really shows how widespread this problem is. And it's not just adults who are targeted. The article says children, especially those with disabilities or who are seen as different, are often accused of witchcraft and abused, sometimes even killed.
It's heartbreaking, yeah. It shows how these accusations are used against the most vulnerable people, the ones who can't defend themselves. It's a terrible cycle of fear, ignorance, and violence.
It's a lot to take in. But we've got a lot more to cover in this deep dive, so let's shift gears and look at Asia and Oceania. The article has some equally disturbing examples from India and Papua New Guinea.
In India, the article has this crazy statistic. Something like 150 to 200 women are killed every year just because people think they're witches.
Wow, that's a lot. Makes you wonder what's behind that kind of violence, right? Is it just blind faith, or is there something else going on?
It's rarely just about superstition. A lot of the time, accusing someone of witchcraft is a way to get something, like a tool. The article talks about cases where it's used to take land, get revenge, even punish women who reject someone's advances.
So it's less about actual magic and more about using those beliefs to get power or
Yeah.
hurt someone.
Exactly. It's using fear and social pressure to get what you want, basically. And often it's women who are already treated unfairly who become the targets.
The article also mentions this really horrific case from Papua New Guinea. Back in 2013, a 20-year-old woman was burned alive just because people accused her of causing a child's death with sorcery.
Yeah.
That's that's just awful.
Yeah, it is. And what's really disturbing is that the accusation came after she had gone to a traditional healer for her own illness. When the healer died too, she was blamed and the whole community turned on her. It's horrible.
It's a reminder that even though traditional healing is common in some places, it doesn't mean people automatically reject logic or modern medicine, right? It's about
Yeah.
having different ways of understanding things, especially when they don't have much access to healthcare or education.
Totally. And this leads to a big question. Why do witch hunts, whether literal or just the idea of them, still happen today? What's at the core of it all?
It's easy to think it's just ignorance or lack of education. But the article suggests that these accusations usually pop up when the usual explanations don't work. It's about trying to make sense of things, especially when people are suffering or have lost someone.
It's about trying to feel in control when things feel chaotic.
The article talks about this anthropologist, E. Evans Pritchard, who studied the Azande people in Africa back in the 1920s and 30s. He found that their beliefs about witchcraft weren't just supernatural explanations. It was more like a way to understand why bad things happened and how to deal with tension in the community.
Evans Pritchard's work was huge because it challenged the idea that societies we call primitive weren't rational. He showed that for the Azande, witchcraft was a way to make sense of the world, like why a building would collapse or someone would get sick even if they were careful.
So it's not just magic, did it? It's more about seeing the world and your relationships with others through that lens of witchcraft.
Exactly. It's a way to explain the things you can't explain and to deal with conflict in the community. That's something we can all relate to, even if we don't literally believe in witches.
That's a good point, because when you think about it, we all have ways of explaining the unexplainable, whether it's through religion, spirituality, or just our own personal beliefs.
Right. Exactly. And that takes us to the metaphorical witch hunt idea. The article talks about how it's become a term for any unfair persecution, where people are targeted based on accusations with no real proof.
That makes sense. It's like seeing those historical witch hunts reflected in what's happening today, even when there's no talk of magic or spells.
Right. It's about seeing those same patterns, making someone the enemy, using fear, ignoring due process, and calling it out no matter where it happens.
And the article uses some pretty scary examples, like the Red Scare in the U.S. during the Cold War. You had Senator Joseph McCarthy going after suspected communists, accusing people left and right without any real evidence. It ruined so many lives and careers.
McCarthyism is like the perfect example of a modern witch hunt. It
Yeah.
played on the fear of communism, made everyone panic, and used those accusations to silence people and gain more power.
It's scary how quickly it all happened, how people were so ready to believe the worst about each other, even their friends.
It shows that this kind of thing can happen anywhere, anytime, even in places that say they're all about democracy.
So how do we protect ourselves from this? How do we spot it and fight back, both online and in real life? Seems like a super complicated problem.
You're right, it is complicated, but I think the first step is just being aware. Understanding the history of witch hunts, the things that cause them, and how they can look different in different situations.
So it's about seeing those warning signs, baseless accusations, making a whole group seem evil, ignoring fair treatment, and recognizing those echoes of the past and what's happening now.
Exactly. And then it's about speaking up against that unfairness, challenging those harmful stories, and demanding proof and accountability.
It's about realizing that staying silent makes you part of the problem and that we all have a responsibility to push back against that fear and prejudice.
Absolutely. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, and defending people who are being targeted, even if you don't agree with them.
It's about understanding that fighting against witch hunts, literal or metaphorical, is about fighting for human rights, for reason, and for a world where fear and suspicion don't win.
You said it perfectly. It's a fight worth having, and it's one we can win, but only if we pay attention and challenge those harmful patterns whenever we see them.
That's a really important message. And talking about paying attention, there's a part in the article that talks about the roots and causes of witch hunts, and I thought it was really interesting. It explores different theories about why these things happen, and it challenges some of the ideas we might have about it.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because as we've seen, witch hunts are really complex, and there's no easy answer to why they happen. It's not just about being uneducated or superstitious. There's more going on like social stuff, psychology, and politics.
You're right, and the article does a great job of explaining all that. It starts by talking about some common misunderstandings, especially when it comes to Africa and Asia. It says it's wrong to assume that people in those regions reject logical explanations just because they believe in witchcraft.
That's so important. It's about recognizing that different cultures have different ways of understanding the world, and those ways aren't necessarily wrong or incompatible with science.
The article uses this great example. Imagine a farmer in Africa whose plow breaks. He's not going to immediately think it's witchcraft. He'll probably first think about practical reasons, like maybe the metal was bad or he hit a rock.
It's about understanding that witchcraft beliefs often come in when those practical explanations don't work, especially with things that are unexplainable or unfortunate.
And it's also important to remember that going to a traditional healer doesn't automatically mean rejecting modern medicine. The article says people often use both, seeing them as working together.
Right, it's about understanding how complex healthcare systems are and how people use them based on what they believe and their experiences. It's not always one or the other.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that people's beliefs and practices are shaped by a lot of things, their culture, society, and personal experiences.
And that's where the article gets really interesting. It digs into some theories about why witch hunts happen, and it gives a whole bunch of ideas, from social perspectives to psychological explanations.
Like a deep dive within a deep dive.
Yeah.
And it shows that there's no one right answer.
Exactly. It's a multi-layered problem, and understanding it means looking at it from different angles and being open to different ideas.
Okay, so let's look at some of those theories. The article mentions this historian, Brian A. Pavlak, who put theories about European witch hunts into 10 categories. It's a pretty long list, covering everything from theories about illness to misogyny to social control.
It's a good place to start if you want to understand the different explanations people have come up with. It helps us move past simple answers and see how complicated this whole thing is.
So let's start with the illness theory. This one says that things like mass hysteria, delusions, or even real illnesses might have played a part in European witch hunts.
It's an interesting theory, especially when you think about the weird behavior people said was because of witchcraft, like convulsions, hallucinations, and speaking in tongues.
Right. But the article says it's hard to make this theory fit with how organized and systematic a lot of witch hunts were. It doesn't really explain why certain groups were targeted or why they made laws to prosecute witches.
Exactly. If it was just mass hysteria, you'd think it would be more random. But a lot of times, witch hunts followed specific patterns, and they were often led by people in power.
The article also mentions geographic origin theories. which link witch hunts to certain places, like mountainous areas or places with economic problems.
Those theories say that maybe the environment or social factors made people more likely to believe in witchcraft or accuse each other.
But again, the article says there's not enough proof to back these theories up. Witch hunts happened in all kinds of places and situations.
Exactly. It's not like you can point to a map and say witch hunts only happen here. It's way more complicated than that.
Then there's the greed theory, which says that maybe the rich and powerful started witch hunts to take people's land and money.
This one argues that accusing people of witchcraft was a way for the powerful to get richer by taking what the accused owned.
Makes sense at first. But the article says that a lot of the accused witches were actually poor and didn't have much. So while greed might have been a factor in some cases, it doesn't seem like the main reason for most witch hunts.
Right. It's important to remember that while some people might have used these accusations for personal gain, that doesn't explain the whole thing.
The article then goes into religious rebellion theories, which look at whether witch hunts were a reaction to threats against religious authority.
This is where things get really interesting. Because when witch hunts were most common, Europe was going through a lot of religious change, with Protestantism challenging the Catholic Church.
One theory is that witch hunts were a way to fight back against real satanic cults that were seen as a threat to Christianity.
This one says that there were actual groups worshiping the devil and that witch hunts were meant to get rid of them and protect Christian society.
Sounds interesting, but the article says there's no real proof that organized satanic groups existed before the 19th century.
Right. This theory is more based on stories and legends than real historical evidence.
Another theory is that they were going after people who practice pagan religions, but they mistook them for devil worshippers.
That one's been popular with some neo-pagan groups, but again, there's not much proof.
So while religious fear and anxieties about heresy definitely fueled witch hunts, it's not likely that they were mainly going after organized groups of heretics or pagans.
Exactly. What we see is that most of the people accused of witchcraft were just ordinary people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
The article also talks about the confessional conflict theory, which connects witch hunts to the tension between Protestants and Catholics during the Reformation.
This one argues that the religious conflicts made witch hunts worse, with each side saying the other one was working with the devil.
But even though there were accusations flying between religious groups, most witch hunts actually targeted people within the same religious community.
Right. It wasn't about one religion against another. It was more about keeping control and order within each group.
Then there's the disaster theory, which suggests that people might have blamed witches for things like plagues, famines, and natural disasters.
This one kind of makes sense, especially when you think about how those events affect people psychologically. When people are dealing with terrible things they can't explain, they look for reasons, and sometimes that leads to blaming someone.
But this theory makes you wonder, disasters have always happened, so why were witch hunts so common in certain times and not others?
Exactly. It's a good question, and it shows that there were other things going on besides just disasters.
The article also mentions a mistaken conspiracy theory, which says that the religious leaders made up the whole thing about demonic witchcraft to justify going after certain groups.
This one says that witch hunts were a way to get rid of people seen as a threat, whether they were religious minorities, political opponents, or just people who didn't fit in.
But again, this theory doesn't really explain how such a weird idea could become so widely accepted and lead to such terrible things.
Right. It's hard to believe that a small group could have made this whole thing happen without people believing it, or at least going along with it.
Then there's the social control or state building theory, which suggests that governments might have used the fear of witchcraft to get more power and enforce their rules.
This theory argues that witch hunts were a way for rulers to get rid of their enemies, stop people from disagreeing with them, and keep things the way they wanted.
It definitely fits with what was happening back then, especially since witch hunts were often used to silence people and get rid of those who challenged authority.
Yeah, but it doesn't totally explain why witches were the enemy.
Right.
And it also doesn't make sense that huge witch hunts would cause chaos and unrest. That seems like the opposite of what a government trying to stay in control would want.
The article then talks about social functionalist or social accusations theories, which focus on how accusing someone of witchcraft could be used for personal or social reasons.
This is where you see how complicated human behavior really is. Because these theories say that witch hunts weren't always about actually believing in witchcraft. It was often about using accusations as a tool to get what you wanted.
Like, someone might accuse another person of witchcraft to blame them for their own bad luck or to get ahead in a fight or disagreement.
Exactly. If your crops failed or your cow got sick, it was easier to blame your neighbor and say they were a witch than to admit you messed up or that bad things just happen.
Or maybe witch hunts were a way to make people feel closer by giving them a common enemy and uniting them against a threat.
This theory says that witch hunts were a way to create a sense of togetherness and purpose within a community. By finding a common enemy, people felt more connected and committed to the group.
These theories are pretty interesting, but the article points out that they don't always explain why individuals made specific accusations or the fact that a lot of witch hunts were driven by real fear and belief.
That's true. It's not always easy to separate personal reasons from social ones or logic from irrationality. Human behavior is messy and complicated, and it's usually driven by a mix of things.
Finally, the article talks about the misogyny theory, which is something feminist scholars often bring up.
This one says that accusing women of witchcraft was a way to control and oppress them, especially those who challenged the traditional roles of men and women or who were seen as dangerous to men's authority.
It's a strong theory, considering that almost all of the people accused and convicted of witchcraft were women.
And it makes sense when you think about the historical context. Witch hunts often happened during times when society and the economy were changing and women were starting to become more independent.
Right. As things were changing and women were starting to have more freedom, maybe there was pushback from people who wanted to keep things the way they were.
Exactly. Witch hunts could have been a way to keep women down, to make sure they followed the rules, and to punish those who dared to be different.
But the article points out that this theory doesn't explain why men and children were also accused and executed for witchcraft.
Yeah, it's part of the explanation, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
So as we can see, there's no one easy answer to why witch hunts happen.
It's complicated, with lots of different things contributing, and it means looking at it from different angles and considering all the theories.
It's about understanding the history, the social stuff, the political stuff, and the psychology of these events and seeing how they all connect and interact.
It's about recognizing that human behavior is complex, and there's no simple way to explain why people do what they do.
It's about being open to different ideas and recognizing that the truth is often complicated and has many sides.
You got it. And that's what makes this topic so interesting and important to learn about.
Well said. Now, I know we've gone through a lot today, but there's one more important thing about witch hunts we need to talk about before we finish.
You mean the long-term effects of these events, right? How they still influence how we understand history, gender, and power.
Exactly. So, let's think about the legacy of witch hunts and what we can learn from them as we try to understand our complicated modern world.
I'm all for that, because knowing about the past can help us avoid making the same mistakes.
Okay, so first, let's acknowledge how truly tragic this was. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people who were accused, persecuted, and often killed for no reason other than fear and superstition.
It's a dark part of human history, and it's important to remember those who were victims and honor their memory.
The article says that around 40,000 to 100,000 people were executed during the main period of European witch hunts. And that's just in one place and one time.
The real number of victims all over the world is probably way higher, and the impact of what happened is still felt in many communities today.
And it's not just about the physical violence, right? The psychological trauma, being excluded from society, the financial hardship. These are all things that last long after witch hunts are over.
You're right. The fear and suspicion that started during these times could stick around for generations, tearing communities apart and leaving wounds that might never fully heal.
And then there's the impact on how we understand gender. Like we talked about, most of the people accused of witchcraft were women.
That shows how deep-rooted misogyny is, how it's been in so many societies throughout history.
Witch hunts often targeted women who were seen as a threat to the traditional power structure, or who challenged the roles men and women were expected to play.
They were accused of being too powerful, too independent, too smart, too sexual, or just too different.
And those stereotypes and prejudices that fueled those accusations still affect how women are seen and treated in many places today.
Absolutely. The legacy of witch hunts is connected to the fight for gender equality and the fight against sexism and discrimination.
It reminds us that the fight for justice never really ends, and that we need to keep fighting against harmful stereotypes and speaking up for the rights of all people.
That's a great point, and I think it's also important to think about the bigger lessons we can learn from witch hunts. They're like warnings about the dangers of fear, prejudice, and abusing power.
They show us how easily societies can give in to mass panic, and how quickly reason and fairness can disappear when fear takes over.
They show how easily people can be blamed and persecuted for no reason other than rumors and false accusations.
And they highlight how important it is to think critically, make decisions based on evidence, and protect the rights of every person.
Exactly. Witch hunts are a stark reminder of what can happen when we abandon reason, give in to fear, and let power go unchecked.
They're a call to action, urging us to be more mindful, more compassionate, and more brave in our pursuit of justice and equality.
They challenge us to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, and to resist the temptation to blame and demonize those who are different from us.
They remind us that the fight for a fair and equal world never stops, and we all have to do our part to make sure the mistakes of the past aren't repeated.
That's beautiful. And speaking of fighting back, there's a section in the article that focuses on how the term witch hunt is used metaphorically. It's not about actual witches anymore, but the patterns are still the same.
Yeah, it's wild how, even when you take away the magic and stuff, witch hunts show these patterns of how people act that keep showing up throughout history. And the article really digs into that. There's a whole section on what it calls the figurative use of the term. Not talking about real witches anymore, but it's like the same playbook,
Right. What's interesting is how witch hunt has become this go-to phrase for a certain kind of persecution. It's that feeling of being unfairly targeted, the rules don't matter anymore, and it's all driven by fear and suspicion. The Salem witch trials, McCarthyism, those are like the big examples, but it just keeps happening.
Yeah, and social media is like this giant amplifier for it, makes it even more intense. It seems like every day there's a new witch hunt online,
Right.
people getting publicly shamed and kicked out of groups based on stuff that's often not even true or taken out of context. It's true. The speed and reach of online stuff can be really damaging. Something that used to be just a rumor in a small town can now spread around the world in minutes.
Yeah, and being anonymous on some platforms makes people feel like they can get away with anything, so they say and do stuff they never would face to face.
It's like mob mentality, but online. These online mobs form so fast,
Yeah.
and they have so much power to ruin reputations, even people's lives. It's scary how fast things can blow up, how one tweet or post can start a whole avalanche of accusations and abuse.
And what's really messed up is how often these online witch hunts go after people who are already marginalized, the ones who are vulnerable to discrimination. We see it with women, minorities, LGBTQ plus folks. Anyone who questions things or has a different opinion can become a target.
It's like we've traded the real burning stake for an online one. You know, online shaming, cancel culture, all these accusations piling up without any real evidence or a chance to defend yourself. It's a digital witch hunt, and it can be just as bad as the ones in history books.
And it goes beyond the internet, too. We see these same things happening in politics, in the news, even in our personal relationships. It's about recognizing the patterns making someone the enemy, using fear, ignoring fairness, and calling it out no matter where we see it.
So to fight back against this, both online and offline, it seems like education is key, right? It's about understanding how these witch hunts work, spotting the warning signs, and being willing to challenge those harmful stories.
Definitely. Knowing more gives you power, and in this case, it's the power to resist being manipulated, to fight for justice, and to create a world where reason and compassion win out over fear and prejudice.
It's about remembering what happened in the past, both the horrible consequences and the bravery of those who stood up and said, no more. It's about honoring them by continuing that fight for a better world.
It's about realizing that the fight against witch hunts, real or metaphorical, never really ends. It's a fight for human rights, for reason, and for everyone to live with dignity and freedom.
Wow, well said. And on that powerful note, I think we've come to the end of our deep dive into witch hunts.
It's been a fascinating journey, a bit unsettling at times, but hopefully it's given our listeners a better understanding of this complex and unfortunately persistent part of human history.
To everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep fighting injustice wherever you find it.
And remember, creating a better world is something we do together. We can't do it alone, so let's stand together and build a world where fear and prejudice don't control us.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.